The Arizona sun hung mercilessly in the cloudless sky, its rays beating down on the parched earth like hammer blows on an anvil. Sarah McKenzie wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her sleeve, leaving a streak of dust across her pale skin. At 25, she had already buried one husband and inherited more responsibility than most men twice her age could handle. The McKenzie ranch stretched across a valley between red mesa formations, a modest spread that her late husband Thomas had carved out of the wilderness 3 years ago. Now, 6 months after Apache raiders had taken his life during a cattle drive, Sarah found herself alone with nothing but debt, dying livestock, and the constant whispers of the townspeople who believed a woman had no business running a ranch. Mrs. McKenzie, you can't keep this up much longer, old Pete Garrison had told her just that morning when she'd ridden into Copper Creek for supplies. The weathered store owner's eyes held more pity than malice, but his words stung just the same. Winter's coming, and those Apache have been getting bolder. Maybe it's time you considered my nephew's offer for the land. Sarah had lifted her chin defiantly, her green eyes flashing with the same fire that had made Thomas fall in love with her back in Kansas. I'll manage just fine, Mr. Garrison. Thomas built this ranch for us, and I won't abandon it, because some folks think I'm not strong enough. But now, as she struggled to repair a section of fence that had been damaged by her restless cattle, doubt crept into her thoughts like shadows at dusk. Her hands, once soft and ladylike, were now calloused and scarred from the endless work. Her auburn hair, which Thomas used to say caught fire in the sunset, was now pulled back in a practical bun beneath a worn hat. The sound of lowing cattle drew her attention to the small herd, grazing near the creek that bordered her property. They looked as weary as she felt, their ribs showing despite her efforts to find them adequate pasture. The summer had been particularly harsh, and the creek was running lower than she'd ever seen it. As evening approached, Sarah realized she would need to fetch water from the river that ran deeper into Apache territory. The creek that supplied her ranch had dwindled to barely a trickle, and her animals were suffering. She'd been putting off this trip for days, knowing the dangers that lurked beyond the familiar boundaries of her land. She loaded 2 large wooden buckets onto her paint mare, Stella, and checked the rifle that hung from her saddle. Thomas had taught her to shoot, though she'd never had to use the weapon in anger. The weight of it was both comforting and ominous, as she guided Stella toward the winding path that led to the Gila River. The ride took her through a landscape painted in shades of gold and crimson by the setting sun. Saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels against the darkening sky, their arms raised in perpetual surrender to the desert's harsh beauty. The air was still warm, but Sarah could feel the promise of cooler temperatures that would come with full darkness. As she neared the river, the sound of running water was like music to her ears. The Gila ran deeper here, fed by springs hidden in the rocky outcroppings upstream. Ancient cottonwoods lined the banks, their leaves whispering secrets in the evening breeze. Sarah dismounted near a bend where the water pooled in a natural basin, perfect for filling her buckets. She tied Stella to a sturdy branch and approached the water's edge, grateful for this life-giving resource that seemed almost sacred in the desert's embrace. She knelt by the water and cupped her hands, bringing the cool liquid to her lips. It tasted of minerals and freedom, so different from the increasingly brackish water of her dwindling creek. As she reached for the first bucket, a sound made her freeze. A splash, followed by the rhythmic movement of someone swimming in the deeper part of the pool upstream. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she crouched lower, instinctively reaching for the rifle. Indians were known to use this river, and a lone woman would be vulnerable prey. But curiosity, that dangerous companion of the brave and foolish, compelled her to peer through the curtain of willow branches that hung near the water. What she saw stole the breath from her lungs and sent heat racing through her body in a way that had nothing to do with the desert sun. A man was bathing in the moonlight that had begun to silver the water's surface, but this was no ordinary man. His bronzed skin gleamed wet in the pale light, stretched taut over muscles that spoke of a life lived in harmony with this harsh land. Long black hair flowed down his back like liquid obsidian, and when he turned slightly, she caught sight of strong features that belonged on ancient warrior sculptures. Apache. There was no mistaking the distinctive clothing folded neatly on the riverbank, the leather breechcloth and high moccasins that marked him as one of the people her neighbors spoke of with equal parts fear and hatred. Sarah knew she should retreat, mount Stella, and ride back to the safety of her ranch as quickly as possible. Instead, she found herself transfixed, watching as he moved through the water with the grace of a natural swimmer. There was something hypnotic about his movements, something that spoke to a part of her she'd thought had died with Thomas. When he emerged from the water, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Water cascaded down his powerful frame as he stood waist-deep in the river, and she could see the play of muscle beneath his skin as he pushed his wet hair back from his face. A jagged scar ran along his left shoulder, testament to battles fought and survived. He was beautiful in the way that wild, dangerous things were beautiful, like a mountain storm or a sunset fire that could destroy as easily as it could inspire. Sarah felt a stirring in her blood that she hadn't experienced since the early days of her marriage, the awakening that both thrilled and terrified her. The Apache warrior seemed to sense something, his head turning toward her hiding place with the alertness of a wild animal. Sarah held her breath, afraid to move, afraid to look away. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, she wondered if their eyes had met across the distance, if he could see her watching him with a hunger she barely understood. Then a night bird called from somewhere upstream, and the spell was broken. Sarah scrambled backward, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it would give her away. She had to get out of there before she was discovered, before she became another victim of the violence that seemed to follow wherever Apache and settlers met. But as she reached for Stella's reins, Sarah realized that something fundamental had changed in those few moments by the river. The image of the warrior was burned into her memory like a brand, and she knew with disturbing certainty that she would never be able to forget what she had seen. The ride back to her ranch passed in a blur of moonlight and confused emotions. The empty buckets, a reminder of her mission's failure. But as Sarah lay in her lonely bed that night, it wasn't thoughts of water or dying cattle that kept her awake. It was the memory of bronzed skin gleaming in moonlight and the dangerous hunger that had awakened within her heart. 3 days passed before Sarah could summon the courage to return to the river. Her cattle grew more desperate for water, and the small creek had finally run completely dry. She told herself it was necessity that drove her back, but the truth burned in her chest like a swallowed ember. She couldn't stop thinking about the Apache warrior. During the long, sleepless nights, she found herself remembering the way moonlight had sculpted his powerful frame, the graceful movements as he'd emerged from the water like some ancient river god. It was madness, she knew. Apache had killed her husband, had raided settlements throughout the territory. Yet the image of this particular man haunted her dreams with an intensity that frightened her. This time, Sarah approached the river in the late afternoon, hoping the earlier hour would mean safety. She'd left Stella tied farther back in the trees and crept forward on foot, carrying just one bucket to minimize the time she'd need to spend at the water's edge. The river ran peaceful and clear, birds calling from the cottonwoods as if this were any ordinary place, instead of the boundary between two worlds at war. Sarah filled her bucket quickly, her eyes constantly scanning the opposite bank for any sign of movement. She was preparing to leave when she heard her name spoken in a deep accented voice that seemed to emerge from the very stones of the riverbank. Sarah McKenzie. Sarah spun around, her hand flying to the pistol at her hip, and found herself face to face with the man who had occupied her thoughts for 3 days. He stood perhaps 20 feet away, having emerged from behind a boulder with the silent grace of a mountain cat. In daylight, he was even more magnificent than memory had painted him. His skin was the color of burnished copper, stretched taut over a frame that spoke of a lifetime spent in physical pursuits. He wore traditional Apache clothing, a leather breechcloth, high moccasins that reached his knees, and a shirt of soft deerskin that emphasized, rather than concealed, his powerful build. A knife hung at his side, but his hands remained relaxed, showing no immediate threat. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of obsidian, dark and unfathomable, yet she thought she detected something in their depths that mirrored her own confusion, a spark of recognition, of attraction that transcended the barriers their peoples had erected. "You know my name," Sarah said, surprised that her voice remained steady despite the wild hammering of her heart. "I know many things about the white widow who tries to run a ranch alone," he replied, his English clear though colored with the musical cadence of his native tongue. "I am called Aiyana." The name meant eternal blossom in Apache, though Sarah couldn't know this. She only knew that the sound of it spoken in his deep voice sent shivers down her spine. "What do you want?" she asked, though she made no move to draw her weapon. Something in his bearing told her that if he'd meant her harm, she would already be dead. Aiyana stepped closer, his movements fluid and controlled. "3 nights ago you watched me bathe in the sacred waters. You did not flee immediately, as most white women would." Heat flooded Sarah's cheeks at his words. I was startled. I didn't mean to intrude. "Yet you looked." His dark eyes seemed to see straight through to her soul. "As I looked at you." The admission hung in the air between them like smoke from a signal fire. Sarah felt her breath catch as she realized what he was saying. He had been aware of her presence, had perhaps even welcomed it. "This is dangerous," she whispered, as much to herself as to him. "If anyone saw us talking—" "The white men in Copper Creek speak of you often," Aiyana said, ignoring her concern. "They say you are foolish to remain on land that belongs to the desert, that Apache will surely take your scalp before winter comes." Sarah lifted her chin defiantly. "And will they?" For the first time, something that might have been amusement flickered in his dark eyes. "That depends, Widow Sarah, on whether you prove to be friend or enemy to my people." "I've never harmed any Apache," Sarah said truthfully. "I know you. Your people killed my husband, but I also know he was running cattle through your hunting grounds. Perhaps the fault was not entirely one-sided." Aiyana studied her for a long moment, as if weighing her words against some internal measure. "Thomas Mackenzie died fighting bravely when he could have surrendered. My brother Nalnish gave him an honorable death." The casual way he spoke of her husband's death should have filled Sarah with rage, but instead she found herself oddly comforted. In the months since Thomas's death, no one had spoken of him with such respect, such acknowledgement of his courage. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you are not like the other whites who come to take our land. You work it with your own hands. You do not seek to drive us away from the water that has sustained my people for countless generations." Aiyana paused, then added more quietly, "And because when you looked at me by the river, there was no fear in your eyes, only curiosity." Sarah felt heat building in her core at his words, at the memory they invoked. "I should go. My cattle need water." "Your cattle will die if you do not find better pasture soon," Aiyana observed. "The summer has been harsh, and winter will be harsher still." "I know that," Sarah said, frustration coloring her voice, "but I have nowhere else to take them. The other ranchers won't let me use their land, and I can't afford to buy feed." Aiyana was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider something. When he spoke again, his words sent shock through Sarah's system. "There is a hidden valley, 2 hours' ride north of your ranch. Good grass grows there, fed by springs that never fail. My people have used it for winter grazing, but this year we will not need it all." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "You're offering to share Apache grazing land with me?" "I'm offering to share it with a woman who shows respect for the desert and its children," Aiyana corrected. "But such an arrangement would require understanding between us." The way he said the word understanding made Sarah's pulse quicken. She sensed layers of meaning beneath the simple term, promises and possibilities that both thrilled and terrified her. "What kind of understanding?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Aiyana stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of him, like sage and mountain air, and something indefinably masculine, the kind that grows between a man and a woman who recognize something in each other that the rest of the world cannot see. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She should run, should mount Stella and never return to this place where dangerous promises hung in the air like heat lightning. Instead, she found herself taking a half-step forward, drawn by something stronger than fear or reason. "This is impossible," she whispered. "We're enemies. Our peoples are at war." "Are we enemies, Sarah McKenzie?" Aiyana asked, his voice low and intense. "When you saw me in the water, did you think of war, or did you think of something else entirely?" Before she could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from somewhere upstream. Aiyana's head snapped up, his warrior instincts instantly alert. "Riders coming, you must go now," he said urgently. "If they find us together—" Sarah grabbed her bucket and started toward the trees where Stella waited, but Aiyana's voice stopped her. "Tomorrow night, when the moon is full, if you want to see the hidden valley." She looked back once and found him watching her with those obsidian eyes that seemed to hold all the secrets of the desert night. Then he melted back into the landscape as if he had never been there at all, leaving Sarah to wonder if the entire encounter had been some fevered dream born of loneliness and desert heat. But as she rode home with her single bucket of precious water, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that tomorrow night would find her riding north under the full moon, toward whatever destiny awaited her in a hidden valley where Apache grass grew green and a dangerous understanding might blossom between two hearts that had forgotten the meaning of the word impossible. The full moon hung like a silver coin in the star-scattered sky as Sarah guided Stella through the desert landscape, her heart pounding with equal measures of anticipation and terror. She had spent the entire day wrestling with her decision, alternating between packing supplies for the journey and telling herself she was foolish beyond measure. But as darkness fell and the moon rose, Sarah found herself saddling her horse with trembling hands. The image of Aiyana's obsidian eyes had haunted her every waking moment, and the promise of salvation for her dying cattle provided the excuse she needed to justify what her heart already demanded. She rode north as he had instructed, following game trails that wound between towering rock formations and sparse vegetation. The desert at night was a different world, alive with sounds and shadows that spoke of ancient mysteries. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and the night wind carried the scent of sage and creosote. 2 hours into her journey, Sarah began to doubt she was traveling in the right direction. The landscape seemed endless, unchanged, and she was beginning to fear she had missed some crucial landmark when a figure materialized from behind a cluster of barrel cacti. Aiyana sat astride a magnificent paint horse, his silhouette striking against the moonlit sky. He wore the same traditional clothing as before, but now Sarah could see additional details: intricate beadwork on his shirt, silver ornaments in his long hair that caught the light like stars. He was breathtaking in his masculine beauty, like some mythical being conjured from the desert itself. "You came," he said, and there was something in his voice that spoke of relief, mixed with surprise. "My cattle are dying," Sarah replied, though they both knew her motivations ran deeper than mere necessity. Aiyana studied her for a moment, his dark eyes unreadable in the moonlight. "Follow me, and stay close. The path ahead is treacherous for those who do not know it." He led her up what appeared to be a solid rock face, but as they climbed, Sarah realized there was a narrow trail hidden among the stone outcroppings. It was barely wide enough for a horse and rider, with sheer drops on either side that made her stomach clench with vertigo. "Do not look down," Aiyana called back to her. "Trust your horse, and trust the path." For 30 terrifying minutes they climbed, the trail switching back and forth across the face of a mesa that seemed to reach toward the stars themselves. Just when Sarah thought she could endure no more, the path leveled out, and they emerged onto a high plateau. What she saw there stole her breath away more completely than any Apache warrior ever could. Before them lay a hidden valley, perhaps 2 miles long and half as wide, nestled between towering walls of red stone. The moonlight revealed lush grass, swaying in the gentle breeze, and she could hear the musical sound of running water somewhere in the darkness. Ancient cottonwoods dotted the landscape like benevolent guardians, their leaves whispering secrets to the night wind. "The Valley of Forever Springs," Aiyana said quietly. "My people have known this place for more generations than the stars can count. The water never fails, the grass never dies completely, even in the harshest drought." Sarah urged Stella forward, barely able to believe what she was seeing. After months of watching her land turn to dust, this verdant oasis seemed like something from a dream. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "My grandfather told me this valley was a gift from the spirits, meant to sustain life when all else fails," Aiyana continued, dismounting near a grove of trees. "He said it should only be shared with those who understand its sacred nature." Sarah dismounted as well, her legs unsteady from both the treacherous ride and the overwhelming emotion of the moment. "Why are you sharing it with me?" Aiyana turned to face her, and in the moonlight she could see the intensity burning in his dark eyes. "Because when I look at you, Sarah McKenzie, I see someone who loves the land as my people do. Not as something to be conquered and used up, but as something to be cherished and protected." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his powerful frame. "And because there is something between us that I have never felt before, something that calls to my soul like the voice of the wind." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as he reached up to touch her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "This is madness," she whispered, even as she leaned into his touch. "Perhaps," Aiyana agreed, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone, "but some kinds of madness are worth the risk." Before she could think to protest, he lowered his head and claimed her mouth with his own. The kiss was everything Sarah had dreamed of, and more, fierce and tender, passionate and reverent. She could taste the wildness in him, the freedom that came from a life lived without the constraints that bound her own world. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Sarah stared up into his face, seeing her own wonder reflected in his dark eyes. "I haven't felt this way since," she began, then stopped, unsure how to explain the resurrection of emotions she'd thought buried with Thomas. "Your husband was a good man," Aiyana said, seeming to understand her struggle. "But he is gone, and you are here, alive and beautiful under the desert moon. There is no shame in choosing to live again." His words unleashed something within Sarah that had been locked away for months. She reached up to trace the strong line of his jaw, marveling at the contrast between his bronze skin and her own pale fingers. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now, we make our understanding real," Aiyana replied, his voice rough with desire. "You bring your cattle here tomorrow night. I will meet you and show you the best grazing areas. But Sarah," he paused, his expression growing serious, "this must remain secret. If my people knew I was helping a white woman, if your people knew you were meeting with an Apache—" "I know," Sarah said quickly. "No one can ever know." Aiyana nodded, then surprised her by taking her hand and leading her toward the sound of running water. They walked through grass that came up to their knees, soft and lush beneath their feet. The stream they found was clear and cold, fed by springs that bubbled up from hidden sources in the rock. "Drink," Aiyana commanded gently. "The water here has special properties. My people believe it can heal both body and spirit." Sarah knelt by the stream and cupped the clear water in her hands, bringing it to her lips. It tasted of minerals and something indefinable, something that seemed to fill her with warmth and energy. When she looked up, Aiyana was watching her with an expression that made her pulse quicken. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I am thinking that I have never wanted anything as much as I want you," he replied with devastating honesty. "And I am thinking that such wanting is dangerous for both our peoples." Sarah stood slowly, water still dripping from her fingers. "Then perhaps we should be very careful not to be caught." The promise in her words hung between them like heat lightning, full of electricity and possibility. Aiyana stepped forward, his hands settling on her waist, and for a moment Sarah thought he might kiss her again. Instead, he rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. "You should go now, before I forget my honor, and keep you here until dawn." Sarah felt a stab of disappointment, but she recognized the wisdom in his words. They were playing with fire, and one careless moment could destroy them both. "Tomorrow night," she said, reluctantly stepping back. "I'll bring the cattle." "I will be waiting," Aiyana promised. The ride back to her ranch seemed twice as long as the journey there, and Sarah found herself looking back frequently, trying to memorize every detail of the hidden valley. By the time she reached her own land, the moon was setting and the eastern sky was beginning to show the first pale hints of dawn. As she unsaddled Stella and made her way to her empty house, Sarah tried to tell herself that this was simply a business arrangement, a desperate woman accepting help from an unlikely source. But the taste of Aiyana's kiss still lingered on her lips, and the memory of his touch burned like a brand against her skin. She was in love with an Apache warrior, and there was no going back from that truth. Tomorrow night, she would return to the Valley of Forever Springs, and with each meeting she would fall deeper into a passion that could destroy everything she had left in the world. But as she lay in her lonely bed watching the sun rise over the desert, Sarah found she didn't care about the risks. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt truly alive, and that was worth any price she might have to pay. For 2 weeks, Sarah lived a double life that both sustained and tormented her. By day, she was the struggling widow fighting to keep her ranch alive, enduring the pitying looks and unsolicited advice of the townspeople. By night, she became someone else entirely, a woman transformed by passion and purpose as she drove her cattle to the hidden valley where Aiyana waited. Their arrangement worked flawlessly. The cattle grew fat on the rich grass and clear water, regaining the weight and strength they had lost during the drought. More importantly, Sarah's heart came alive again through stolen hours spent in Aiyana's company. He taught her things about the desert that no white person had ever learned: which plants could heal, which stars guided travelers home, how to read the language written in animal tracks and cloud formations. In return, she shared stories of her life before Arizona, her dreams for the ranch, and the loneliness that had nearly consumed her after Thomas's death. Their conversations took place in hushed tones as they watched the cattle graze under moonlight, sitting close enough to feel each other's warmth but rarely touching. The restraint was both agonizing and exquisite, building a tension between them that grew stronger with each passing night. On this particular evening, Sarah arrived at the valley to find Aiyana waiting by the stream, his expression more serious than usual. The autumn air carried a chill that hinted at the coming winter, and she pulled her shawl closer as she approached him. "What's wrong?" she asked, recognizing the warrior's alertness in his posture. "My brother Nalnish has been asking questions about my movements," Aiyana said without preamble. He suspects I am meeting with someone from the white settlements." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. "What will you tell him?" "Nothing, for now. But Nalnish is not a fool, and he has the patience of a hunter. Eventually he will follow me." Aiyana turned to face her, his dark eyes reflecting the starlight. "There is something else. The army has sent more soldiers to Fort Huachuca. They speak of a final campaign to drive all Apache from the territory." The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had heard rumors in town about increased military activity, but she had pushed such thoughts away, unwilling to acknowledge the threat they posed to her secret world. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Perhaps a month, maybe less. The soldiers will wait until after the first snows, when they believe we will be weakened by winter." Aiyana's jaw tightened. "They do not understand that winter is when Apache become most dangerous, like wolves driven by hunger." Sarah moved closer to him, drawn by an impulse she couldn't name. "What will you do?" "What I must. Protect my people, fight if necessary." He looked down at her, and she saw pain in his eyes that had nothing to do with the coming war. "But Sarah, when the fighting begins, our meetings must end. It will not be safe for you to come here." "No." The word escaped her lips before she could think, sharp and desperate. "There has to be another way." Aiyana reached up to cup her face in his hands, his touch infinitely gentle. "Do you think I want to lose you? Do you think any of this is easy for me?" For the first time since their meetings began, Sarah allowed herself to truly consider what their relationship meant to him. As the daughter of Kansas farmers, she had always known her place in the world, but Aiyana was a war leader among his people, a man whose decisions could mean life or death for an entire tribe. The risk he was taking by meeting with her was enormous. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't think about what this costs you." "It costs me nothing," Aiyana said fiercely. "You are worth any price. That is why this is so dangerous." The intensity in his voice sent heat spiraling through Sarah's body. Without thinking, she rose on her toes and kissed him, pouring all her fear and longing into the contact. This time, Aiyana didn't pull away. His arms came around her, crushing her against his chest as he deepened the kiss with a passion that spoke of weeks of careful restraint, finally breaking free. When they separated, both were breathing hard. Aiyana rested his forehead against hers, his hands still tangled in her hair. "Sarah," he said, her name a prayer on his lips, "what you do to me, it is like nothing I have ever known." "Then don't let it end," she pleaded. "There has to be a way for us to be together." Before Aiyana could answer, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the valley. He immediately pushed Sarah behind a large boulder, his hand moving to the knife at his side. "Stay down," he commanded quietly. "Do not move until I tell you." 3 Apache warriors rode into the clearing, their horses' hooves muffled by the thick grass. Even in the moonlight, Sarah could see that one of them bore a strong resemblance to Aiyana, the same proud bearing, the same powerful build. This had to be Nalnish, the brother who suspected something. The men spoke in rapid Apache, their voices carrying clearly in the night air. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakably tense. She watched as Aiyana gestured toward the cattle, apparently explaining their presence. Nalnish rode closer to the herd, examining them with a warrior's eye for detail. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Nalnish asking what sounded like increasingly pointed questions. Sarah held her breath, terrified that at any moment one of the warriors would discover her hiding place. Her cattle bore her brand, clearly marking them as belonging to a white rancher. If Nalnish put the pieces together, finally, the 3 men turned their horses and rode back the way they had come. Sarah remained hidden until their hoofbeats faded completely, then emerged from behind the boulder on shaking legs. Aiyana's face was grim as he watched her approach. That was too close. Nalnish is suspicious, and he has always been able to read me too well. "What did you tell him?" "That I was scouting the valley for signs of white encroachment, and that I found cattle that had wandered far from their home range." Aiyana shook his head. He did not believe me, but he could not prove otherwise. Sarah felt the weight of reality crushing down on her like a physical force. "This is impossible, isn't it? We're from different worlds, and those worlds are about to go to war." "Perhaps," Aiyana said quietly. "But tonight we are here together, and that is not nothing." He reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. What I feel for you, it goes beyond desire, beyond anything I thought possible between a man and a woman of different peoples." "I know," she whispered. "I feel it too. If circumstances were different, if we had met in another time, Another place. He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Sarah squeezed his hand, drawing strength from the contact. Then we make the most of the time we have, however long or short it might be. Aiyana studied her face in the moonlight, as if trying to memorize every detail. You would risk everything for stolen moments with an Apache warrior? I would risk everything for you, Sarah replied, without hesitation. Whatever that makes me. Foolish, reckless, unfit to be a proper widow, I don't care. For the first time since Thomas died, I feel like I'm truly living. Her words seemed to break something loose inside Aiyana. He pulled her into his arms again, holding her as if she might disappear at any moment. Then we will find a way, he said against her hair. Somehow, we will find a way to be together. As they stood in the hidden valley surrounded by Sarah's contented cattle, both knew they were making promises that might be impossible to keep. War was coming, and the forces arrayed against them were far more powerful than their love, no matter how strong it might be. But in that moment, under the stars that had witnessed countless other impossible loves throughout history, they chose to believe in possibility rather than surrender to despair. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they would face it together, bound by a connection that transcended the artificial boundaries their peoples had drawn in the desert sand. The night wind carried the sound of distant coyotes, their calls echoing across the valley like a song of the wild. It was a song Sarah was finally learning to understand, and as Aiyana's arms tightened around her, she knew she was exactly where she belonged. The first snow of winter arrived 3 weeks later, dusting the desert in pristine white that transformed the harsh landscape into something ethereal and beautiful. Sarah watched it fall from her kitchen window, knowing that somewhere in the mountains, Aiyana was preparing for what might be their people's final confrontation. She hadn't seen him in 5 days, the longest they had been apart since their meetings began. The separation felt like a physical ache, made worse by the knowledge that soldiers from Fort Huachuca had been seen scouting the area around her ranch. The noose was tightening around their secret world. That evening, as Sarah was securing her barn against the snow, she heard the soft whinny of a horse approaching through the storm. Her heart leaped with hope and fear in equal measure. When Aiyana emerged from the swirling white, leading his paint horse, she nearly cried with relief. "You shouldn't have come," she said, even as she ran to him. "It's too dangerous." "I had to see you," Aiyana replied, pulling her into his arms. His body was cold from the ride, but his embrace was warm and fierce. "Tomorrow my people move to winter camp in the high country. It may be months before we can meet again." Sarah felt her world tilting on its axis. Months without seeing him, without the stolen hours that had become the center of her existence. "Take me with you," she said impulsively. Aiyana pulled back to look at her, his dark eyes wide with surprise. "Sarah, you cannot mean that." "Why not? I have nothing left here. The townspeople barely tolerate me. My ranch is failing despite the help you've given me. And when the war comes—" She shuddered, unable to finish the thought. "You would leave everything? Your home, your people, your entire world?" "My world is wherever you are," Sarah said with quiet conviction. "That's what I've learned these past weeks. Without you, everything else is just existing." Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as the snow continued to fall around them. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Life among my people would be hard for you. Many would never accept a white woman, no matter how much I might love her. And Sarah," he cupped her face in his hands, "I do love you. More than life, more than honor, more than the sacred mountains themselves." The words she had longed to hear sent warmth flooding through her entire body. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've loved you since that first night by the river, when you emerged from the water like something from a dream." They kissed then, desperately and passionately, as if they could pour all their longing and fear into that single contact. When they separated, both were breathing hard. "There is a way," Aiyana said suddenly, his eyes bright with an idea that was either brilliant or insane. "But it would mean giving up everything you have ever known. Tell me, in 3 days, when the moon is dark, my people will perform the ceremony of winter moving. There will be chaos, confusion, many people coming and going. If you were to disappear from your ranch that night, if it appeared that Apache raiders had taken you—" Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she understood what he was suggesting. "They would assume I was dead, or captured, which amounts to the same thing in their minds. No one would look for a dead woman." Aiyana's hands tightened on her arms. "But Sarah, once you cross that line, there can be no going back. You would become Apache, or you would become nothing." The magnitude of what he was proposing struck Sarah like a physical blow. To leave behind everything she had ever known, everyone she had ever been, for an uncertain future among people who might never accept her. It was madness. It was also the only path to happiness she could see. "What would I need to do?" she asked. Aiyana's eyes blazed with a mixture of joy and terror. "Leave signs of a struggle at your ranch. Take only what you can carry on horseback. Meet me at the hidden valley when the moon sets on the third night. And then? Then we ride north to the winter camp, and I present you to my grandfather as the woman I have chosen for my wife." Aiyana's voice grew solemn. "He is wise and fair, but he is also Apache to his bones. He will test you in ways I cannot predict." Sarah thought of her empty house, her failing ranch, the lonely bed where she had spent so many sleepless nights. Then she thought of the life she might have with Aiyana, difficult, uncertain, but filled with a love so powerful it took her breath away. "I'll do it," she said without hesitation. Aiyana closed his eyes, as if her words were both his greatest hope and his greatest fear. "Are you certain?" "Once this path is chosen—" "I'm certain," Sarah interrupted. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." 3 nights later, Sarah McKenzie ceased to exist. She scattered her belongings around the ranch house, overturned furniture, and left her torn dress hanging from a nail near the door. To anyone who found the scene, it would appear that Apache raiders had taken her in the night. She felt a pang of grief for the life she was abandoning, but it was overwhelmed by anticipation for the life that awaited her. The ride to the hidden valley felt like a journey between worlds. With each mile, she left behind the person she had been and moved towards someone entirely new. When she reached the valley, Aiyana was waiting for her as promised, his face grave with the weight of what they were undertaking. "Last chance to change your mind," he said as she dismounted. Instead of answering with words, Sarah reached into her saddlebags and pulled out the wedding dress she had worn to marry Thomas 7 years ago. Without ceremony, she threw it into the fire Aiyana had built, watching the white silk and lace curl and blacken in the flames. "Sarah McKenzie is dead," she said quietly. "Who do I become now?" Aiyana smiled for the first time that night, and the expression transformed his face completely. "You become Itzel, she who is treasured above all else, and you become my wife, if you will have me." "Yes," Sarah said, her voice strong and clear. "In whatever world we make together, yes." The ceremony that followed was simple but profound. In the light of the burning dress, Aiyana spoke words in Apache that she didn't understand, but felt in her soul. He placed a necklace of turquoise and silver around her throat, and she gave him a simple gold band that had belonged to her father. When dawn broke over the hidden valley, it illuminated 2 people who had been forever changed by love and courage. The journey to the Apache winter camp would be difficult, and the life that awaited them would be fraught with challenges neither could fully anticipate. But as they rode north together through the snow-covered desert, Sarah felt a peace she had never known before. She had chosen love over safety, passion over propriety, and whatever trials lay ahead, she would face them with Aiyana at her side. Behind them, the sun rose over an empty valley where a white widow had once grazed her cattle and dreamed of impossible things. Ahead lay mountains shrouded in mystery, and the promise of a love that had transcended every boundary their warring peoples had tried to erect. In the end, Sarah thought, some boundaries existed only to be crossed by those brave enough to step beyond them. And as Aiyana's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining as naturally as streams converging into a river, she knew she had found her true home at last, not in any place, but in the heart of the man who had taught her that love was the only frontier worth exploring. The desert wind carried the sound of their horses' hoofbeats across the vast landscape, a rhythm that spoke of new beginnings and ancient wisdom. Somewhere behind them, the townspeople of Copper Creek would soon discover signs of Sarah McKenzie's apparent fate, and shake their heads at the tragedy of a woman who had dared to live alone in Apache country. They would never know that Sarah McKenzie had not died that night, but had instead been reborn as something far more precious than they could imagine. A woman who had found love beyond the boundaries of race and culture, and had chosen to follow her heart into a future as limitless as the desert sky.